Welcome. It is 6 o'clock. It is time for us to start. Now, if you weren't here last night, I talked about what life could look like, and I limited myself to 30 minutes, which might have hurt it a little bit. So if you want to go back and watch that, it's probably still somewhere. If you can't find it, let me know and I can post a replay. Because what I wanted people to do was just sit quietly and hear the words and think about what it would like to have more of a physical awareness and reality in your life. And then the emotions, the cognitions, the spiritual life, social life, environmental life, all embodied. What what would that feel like for you? What would that sound like for you? What would that taste like for you? That's because it's your life. Okay. But these were just some of the possibilities. Now, one of the things I want you to be aware of is this is the page on my website. The website is raiseyourresilience.com. And then under resources, you can see it on this tab here, information and practices that informed us. I have a list of the trainings I've taken, which includes my certification process, which is 2 years, and the stuff I've read, studies I've read, stuff I continue to read. This has been ongoing since 2013. So and it doesn't include, I got tired of including studies. And you'll notice that in the book, some of them might have parentheses because I've gone back through some of them to include the number of studies in that book. So like right now I'm reading Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and the Emissary, and it's talking about the two different hemispheres of the brain and sort of their relationship with it. And I'm glad I'm not going to try to include all the studies off of that one because yes, it is chock full of them. Some of those pages have 5, 6, or 7 notes for different studies. That's amounting to large numbers per chapter. And so it's, all of those books that I've read, those lists are in. You can go check out the books and read the studies yourselves. This is all of the science that supports the things that I teach. Okay. So tonight we are going to talk, and last night, so we talked about the life, and I use that as an anchor point because what I want you to see is that if you've been traumatized, doesn't it feel a little bit like we've been dragging a ball on a chain? It did for me. I mean, you could use the word haunting, followed you everywhere, which is true. So I might get up and I might move. Some people do this. They will either move, thinking if they moved away from their environment, things will get better. It doesn't, because trauma, well, we'll get to this in a minute. Anyway, it goes where you go for a reason, plain and simple. So knowing that this is haunting us, ball and chain, I don't care what word you want to use, we can cut that off. That slavery can end. And so we're going to be looking at that here tonight, and it's a wonderful feeling. All right, so tonight we will just define what stress and trauma is, and we're going to look at it in a few different perspectives. Okay, so first off, and this definition that I'm putting up here, and all the ones I used last night, were informed by all these authors that I have read over the last, almost 12 years now, and this one's no different. So let me just remind you here that let's look at PTSD. Okay, so people argue about the D. Is it an injury? Is it a disorder? Is it this? Is it that? I think there's a good reason to call it the D, but even if we want to, we just kick that out of there. Now we go to the other side. We got post. You know, that almost goes without saying because it certainly wouldn't be pre. So let's go bing. And what does that leave us with? What do you see here? An S and a T. And the S is the noun. If there's no stress, there's no trauma. I'll show you that here in a minute, because what I want you to see here is these are definitions and pretty much, I'm going to say primarily, Hans Selye, who coined the term in 1938, didn't particularly care for it. He preferred the word I put in here. Peter Levine, Robert Sapolsky, Dr. Sapolsky, and I'll say Dr. Berceli. Stress. What is stress? Stress is a cyclical, autonomic, neurophysiological strain. We'll look at that in a picture here in a minute, on somatic resources in response to a perceived threat, let's say signal, that primarily demands a physical engagement. Okay, we'll unpack this here for a minute. Trauma is the infected, rupturing wound of accumulated and incomplete stress cycles, unintegrated fear and pain created in the body and then infecting the psyche. I'm going to show this to you in pictures, but let's do this again. Just, you need to know that stress is a cycle. It has the way we've evolved as human beings, and most mammals have it's a cycle. It gets turned on, and the body contains the off as well as the on. So it's a neurophysiological strain. In other words, there's resources in our body that are called upon for us to do a primarily physical engagement. Fight or flight. You either fight or you flee. Okay, those are the two primary ones. When those two are insufficient, then we go into freeze. No, fawning is not one of them. Folding is the last one. And that, if you look at my website, after you check out this list of books and stuff, go to the videos, because the very first video there is a impala that is in I believe it's a jaguar. It's in his mouth. Now, if he's got the black lines, it's a cheetah, but I think it's a jaguar, or not, leopard. So he's got the nose of the impala in his mouth. They're both down on the ground. Is that freeze? I would think so. Is that fold? Pretty darn close. I got to think it's right there. There's no fawning. I think fawning is a trauma response behavior. It is not necessarily a trauma response, because I don't hear any of the primary people who are teaching about trauma using that term. That's just something that's been thrown out by people who anyway. So stress is cyclical. If you get activated and you don't have a solid understanding that this has been completed and discharged, then that cycle is still active in your body. All right. Now, the perceived threat signal could be either a real, actual physical threat, fire in the corner, or all of a sudden I look outside and I see that, oh, my garage is on fire. Okay, there's a problem. There's a real threat here. Or it could be a perceived threat. And that could range in any kind of environment. You know, if they're talking about layoffs at work, that's a perceived threat. You're going to go into the stress response. And do we ever come out of it? So trauma is the infected, rupturing wound of accumulated and incomplete stress cycles. I put in the unintegrated fear and pain from Bonnie Badenoch because I think there's some truth to that. If we complete these cycles, this is what brings this unintegrated into integrated. I don't integrate the fear and the pain. I integrate the experience because I complete it and then discharge that energy. And I'll show you how that energy thing works. I use the word wound here. Now, the word trauma is a weird one because trauma is just, that's a transliteration of the Greek term. It's like the word baptize. You know what the word baptize means? It's actually from the Greek word baptismo, or maybe it's baptizo. Either way, the word itself means immerse. I take my cup and I immerse it in the sink, which is full of soapy water. All right. But apparently, particular people didn't want to use that word immerse because that's what I'm going to say the uneducated and unlearned people understood that that's what baptized meant. So they decided that they could just sprinkle. But since the word immerse was the translation, oh, cool. Is that anyway? We'll get to that a little bit. I might come back to that, LinkedIn user. Anyway, so this word trauma is kind of like the word baptize. Instead of putting in the translation of the word, they just anglicized it and blah. Here we go. Because trauma is a wound. I was an EMT, and when I was out in the field, guess what I was looking for? Yeah, trauma. Trauma that made you bleed too much. Had to stop that. B, made you not breathe enough. I had to change that. You got 3 minutes without air. And then C, the last thing I was looking for, so the 1, 2, 3, is if you told me you were Eleanor Roosevelt and the year was 1897, now I'm knowing that there's potentially a wound up inside the skull. Okay? Those were the kinds of things that I was looking for. And then I learned, and now some people call it psychological trauma, but guess what? That's not the nature of trauma. This stress cycle is neurophysiological, and we'll get into it a little bit more broadly here. All right. So these cycles are created in the body and then come back to the psyche. So what's going on in our psyche is symptomatic. It is not its nature, which should tell you a lot about the healing. And we'll get into that a little bit later on, more in the next couple of nights. All right. So there's your T and your S of any PTSD. And in the official PTSD, it's traumatic stress. Trauma is not an event. I change it. I think it's an adverb to traumatizing stress because it fits this. And this is taken from all of those people in my little list on my website of all the books that I've read over the last 12 years. So let's move away from this one. Hi again. And we'll go to this one. Now, this is based pretty much on Stephen Porges's writings about the polyvagal nerve. Now, we've all heard about fight or flight. If we're going to go into fight or flight, where are we leaving from? It's nice to know these kind of things, isn't it? Well, in the polyvagal nerve, because as we saw back here, and I skipped it, stress is autonomic. All right. One of the books that I've read, and I'll include the name here, is Rick Hanson. So here's what happens. It's autonomic, which means that we have the amygdala, the amygdalae, and the hippocampi, but we call them the hippocampus and the amygdala. That's the flight nerve. Polyvagal includes the vagal nerve. Thank you. It's the vasovagal, dorsal vagal, and so forth. Anyway, when the amygdala perceives threat, once it attaches, I mean, we'll do all kinds of things. We'll scan this, we'll look at it. But once the brain decides to choose the word threat to put to that signal, it goes from the amygdala to the brainstem, and that's where it becomes autonomic. All kinds of things happen within milliseconds that you have absolutely no control over. Just like you don't have any control over changing your body temperature unless you're really, really well trained. You don't have any control over the little small window of your pH balance in your body. Your body does all that all by itself. It does all kinds of things in your gut that you have no control over. And it's the vagus nerve, this autonomic vagus nerve, that communicates a lot of that stuff, what's going on in our viscera, to our brain. In fact, 80% of the fibers in this big nerve go from guts to brain. 20% go down. That tells you how important that is. Anyway, when we get the threat response, we have been kicked out of social engagement, which is this bottom green zone here in the picture. All right. So if you were with me last night, no problem, LinkedIn user, no problem at all. Thanks for engaging. Thanks for listening. So if you're in social engagement and you get kicked out of it, forgot what my point was going to be. Anyway, what ends up happening, last night I was talking about all these different aspects, the spiritual, the emotional, the social, all of those things. Those are all components that could be populating this green zone word-wise. That's how rich life is there. What happens then is, and this is kind of the idea of the squiggly line, is that we can move in and out of this, but I don't think that's horribly accurate. Anyway, we get kicked out of it into fight flight. And so in fight flight, there's you see how that's a hump supposed to come all the way over. You'll see on the right side, it says the deactivation. Yeah, that's the part nobody does. So the reason I circled the blue there is because that is the state of trauma, or up there, that circle in the freeze is the state of trauma. And you'll see how some people have different expressions of trauma in their own life. Hypervigilance, this emotional set that we see here in the circle, which I think might be primarily default. And then if you look up at the freeze, this is kind of the tone of their life. Now, one of the tones of fight flight is hypervigilance. Really easy to get into a fight, wanting to get into a fight, wanting to argue, wanting to do this, wanting to do that. And then there's a lot of people then who, that blue squiggly line up there, who operate between fight and freeze, depending on the circumstance. So, and this is kind of one I've used in my workshops before. Honey, we need to talk. Well, boom, kicked right into fight or flight. You know darn well, you better not flee or start a fight. So what do? Shut the yap. We freeze. And what does that turn into? How come every time I say I want to talk to you, you shut up, you blah, 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 and it's turned into a fight now. Anyway, these blue areas, that is the state of trauma. We never get deactivated and then come back into social engagement, which on the basis of our autonomic nervous system is the place of health and growth. The very things I was talking about last night, the only place we can experience those is in social engagement. We can use things to kind of paint the fight, flight, freeze sepulcher. And so we come with what is biblically referred to as a whitewashed sepulcher. In psychological terms, we call it bypassing. Spiritual bypassing is a bigger subject, but that's what people do because they're looking to get back into social. Our whole being is hardwired. Well, there's a couple of things where we're a social creature, and that's where social engagement, that is where we are evolved to be. So if you're kicked out into fight flight and you're staying there, you're fighting nature. Everything about us wants to heal, which to me is exciting. Because what I teach people, and we'll discuss this Thursday and Friday, is how I help people do that. It doesn't take much, actually. But this isn't a microwave fix. If you've been in this fight, flight, freeze for 60 years, I guarantee you it's not a microwave fix. It's not 2 weeks. It's not 2 nights. It's not 2 months. I'd be darn surprised if it was 2 years, but it's also not a life sentence. So let's look at this. And if you want to zoom in on that and look at some of this other stuff here, please do that. And if you have questions, Lecky@raiseyourresilience.com. And I can send you these images. These are not mine. So this is one way of looking at what happens in fight flight. And it includes some of these psychological things. So look what happens to the emotional range. It gets narrowed up quite a bit. And what do you think happens to belief systems if you're in fight flight a lot? What kind of beliefs are you going to have? Just a thought, huh? All right. So now we're going to go to this little guy. All right. This is out of Peter Levine's book. I believe it's in an Unspoken Voice. That's the title of the book. See what happens here? This is what happens when the body receives the neuroendocrine, and systemic components of the fight-flight reaction, which I think is what that's supposed to say. Anyway, you can see here how many of those lines are pointing at the brain. Yep, that's right. Not one. So you see here, and there's the little part of the brain on the brain's image on the side there. And that is the amygdala and the hippocampus and the whole HPA axis that activate all kinds of hormones and stuff. The eyes, the ears, the throat, the muscles, the cardiorespiratory system, the stomach, the immune system, the reproductive system are all affected within milliseconds. Because if the thing that is the threat has large teeth and thinks you're a good meal, you either better be able to run fast or fight well. Part of me wants to say good luck with that. But all of these things are affected. This is a guy who's just been kicked out of that social engagement zone into fight flight. And so in this fight flight, all of these things change. Now, social engagement is another way of saying equilibrium. This is my perspective. Now, this guy, you can tell all of these systems definitely get kicked out of somatic equilibrium. We are no longer in conditions of growth and health. So if you stay stuck in this, look at this guy's face. There's your belief systems. Kind of an angry, fearful face. Look at the muscles, tense. What do you think happens when your stomach is stuck in fight? Now, and stuck is the word that Porges uses in his new book, Polyvagal Safety. And accumulated stress cycles is Levine verbiage. But anyway, you have all of these things that have been kicked out of equilibrium. Your immune system is on immediately, but that's only if you deactivate. If you don't deactivate, now all of a sudden your immune system shuts off and we get inflammation. What's happening here is you have all of these systems that are knocked out of equilibrium. So if you're breathing full belly breath. If you were laying on the ground, how can I not have a book nearby? All right. I should be able to take this book, put it on my stomach, take a breath in, and make the book go up. I've been in workshops, and this is kind of how I can tell when people have tightness here because of this cardiorespiratory. When the diaphragm gets tight, because now I need to breathe fast. Because now my heart's beating faster, and my heart needs air, so that the diaphragm is just, instead of doing, it's doing, so the diaphragm gets tight. It's like picking up a kettlebell. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? Oh, that thing is going to get tight. Oh, God, how much longer can I do this? Then you get injured. That's just the cardiorespiratory. It shuts off since health and growth aren't on the scope anymore, digestive system, boom, offline. Glucose, insulin, got to have energy. Boom. Why? We need what? What do we need? Energy for what? Fighting and fleeing. So the body shunts blood to where it's needed. Takes it from here, changes your eyes. Oh, yeah, it does. Kind of scopes it out a little bit, dilates the pupils, and takes blood from your prefrontal cortexes. I don't need those. Now is the time of instinct. There's a reason all this stuff happens in milliseconds, and that is so you can survive. You don't have the time to say, oh, wait a minute. You need to be moving one way, shape, form, or another. Now, with some really, really good training, you might find those places where you can say, well, wait a minute, to create a better opening for yourself. Otherwise, you want this to be instinct. And without that training, the way your brain works, and I've read this, I learned this in Krav Maga, but I've also read this in Peter Levine's book, Trauma and Memory. Your brain is always looking for, and this is how the left hemisphere does this quite a bit. It's looking for a file that defines how things are. So we see the word threat, and we're getting ready for the whole fight flight thing in milliseconds. This thing is going through the file because it's looking for the file that says it has the name handgun on it or the raised hand of the spouse. And when it finds that file, it reads the file because that's where the response is. The response we have learned to do. If it goes through the files and does not find a file, can't figure out a response, that's when it goes into freeze. And all of that is autonomic. If you're sitting here, and I'm sitting here, I sat here for most of my life. I didn't start healing till I was 58. When we're sitting here and these things are happening, it is for our survival. When we heal, we do not lose the stress response. It just changes. Oh, we'll be looking at that. That's pretty, that's really, really great news. But this is what ends up happening physiologically, as you can see primarily here. It creates that tightness in the diaphragm. Now, if your heart's and your brain starts to look at everything as a threat, what do you think's happening to the arteries? So this thing's pumping really, really hard. Now, imagine the size of the arteries and veins, not the ones on the back of my hand, because those split into much smaller ones. They get all the way down into the tip of my finger here. And this thing is beating like a madman. Well, what do you think that's doing when that blood's rushing through to this tiny, tiny, tiny little vein or artery and then a vein? to the walls, start to damage them. Guess what builds up there? Plaque. And you know how small the artery is on your heart? Yeah, they're really small. And there are arteries and veins on your heart. So if we correct this guy with his, it can change our physiology. Consider all of these things. Well, let's just call the immune system disorders. Look those up. The reproductive issues. Shall we say the little blue pill? How about irritable bowel syndrome? Yeah, might want to look into the size of that one. Heart disease? Now Robert Sapolsky says that stress can definitely causes cancer. And I'm not remembering quite how that works right now. I would have to reinvestigate that book. That book is Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And he's a great writer. But most of that diabetes, the glucose insulin relationship. And when you're in this kind of state constantly, that's called chronic stress. That's a state of trauma. When you're in this constantly, your body is screaming for energy. It's not screaming for protein to build. We have been kicked out of health and building. We are screaming for energy for fight or flight, and we don't do any of it. What do you think is going to happen when we sit around like this, don't move as much as would be beneficial for us, and then eat most, because your body has learned to burn carbohydrates. That's how we evolved. And well, I don't have any handy. The packaged ones that are packaged in seed oils that add to the inflammation that's already accumulating in our bodies. And what do you think that's doing to the glucose insulin relationship? Yeah, baby. Now, I haven't mentioned the endocrine system, the cortisol that's racing through our bodies because of the stress. It begins to change. Rick Hanson talks about this in his book, Buddha's Brain. It changes the shape and size of some of your brain regions. So not only have I lost blood, and that's called hypofrontality, all right, now that I've lost a little bit of the blood that's supposed to be up here, and I have all these hormones racing around that are meant to be acute, they are starting to change the size. My amygdala gets bigger. That's the smoke alarm in my brain. The hippocampus is kind of the brakes on that. And all of a sudden now, smoke alarm, it's going off all the time. Fire, 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 fire. When in reality, I mean, I've often used the example of the boss calls you into the office and hands you a pink slip. Now, if he pulled out a firearm and said, here, it's your turn to die, and there's bodies in his office, okay, that is a real threat. I'm not going to argue that. Pink slip. Hate to do this to you, but I don't have a choice. We interpret it neurophysiologically as a threat. Now, if you're in the state of trauma already, that will probably cause you to go into freeze. And yes, we perceive that as a threat because guess what? It kind of is. In 2019, I'll tell you a quick story here so I can wrap this up. In 2019, my then partner said, you need to move out. We were having some issues, and okay, I moved out. In 2 months, I lost that relationship, the place I was living at. We were driving her vehicle, and I didn't have one because I'd sold mine. So I didn't have a vehicle. The job I did have at the time closed its doors. So now I'm out of a job. what else happened that way? I had, oh, yes. Um, I was teaching Krav Maga, which is hand-to-hand combat. It's a martial art. And the instructor just decided, well, he moved. Okay. Whoops. So that was done. And then a friend of mine from high school died, and my stepmom, all in 2 months. Now, I started healing back in 2013. Pretty much by 2019, I was done. My personal perspective on this was that was my year of grieving, because from April 15th, actually, through the end of the year, I did more grieving. I cried that 8 months. But from the time I was asked to move out, and I found a couch I could sleep on for a while, I secured within the next couple of months another place to live. I had to completely rebuild my life. I had nothing except my books and my drum kit. So, place to live. I secured a vehicle. I didn't have a relationship. Didn't have to worry about that. Can't do anything about it, but I grieved my losses. But I was able to take all of those things that I had lost that really meant something, like A, place to live, B, vehicle, B, C, place to live. Important stuff, right? What had happened between 2013, or actually I could go back to 2011 when I had a nervous breakdown, and 2019 is I started to heal my nervous system. And so in that process of healing, I started moving things literally in my own body. So by the time, so when, in 2011, my personal world completely collapsed, complete breakdown. In 2019, it was my circumstances that broke down, not me. So I was out pounding the pavement looking for a place to live, looking for a car, and looking for a new roof over my head. And I got them all. That's the difference that healing can make. And despite the fact I was grieving and all this stuff, my body was not in this condition of freeze. And it wasn't in the state of fight or flight. I was worried to some extent. But I just started pounding the pavement. Literally. I didn't have a car. Sometimes I could borrow one. But boy, I was making copies of my resume, filling out applications, because at that point in time, career-wise, it mattered little. I needed income. And I got it. That's the difference that healing can make. Despite the fact that I was going through all this grieving, that I accomplished all of that. So we're back to, we'll quit looking at Frank here. The cyclical autonomic neurophysiological strain. Oh, baby. It wants demand on my body in response to this perceived threat that primarily demands a physical engagement. It wants fight, wants flight. If it's overwhelming, it's going to shut you down. No choice. And if we don't complete those cycles, that's what turns into trauma. I watched a webinar once, and there were 16 people that were invited to present as experts on healing trauma. And the host, I thought, made a good move, asked them to define trauma. That's where my definition, that's why I came up with one. Because of these 16, not one of them could come up with the definition. I was stunned. And this were people from some major modalities, a lot of, independence. It doesn't surprise me. And, trauma means wounded. Yeah, kind of not. The way I'm looking at it these days, it's really a state of my body's out of equilibrium, no longer in it. And that begins to affect my psyche, because my psyche counts on my body being in equilibrium. Everything does, because we are a unified being. Emotions, thoughts, body. So what word do we use? Okay, that's how I'm looking at the word trauma. And I'll end here because I want you to know something. It is because of this nature that trauma is completely curable. Completely curable. Anyway, hope to see you tomorrow night. Part 3, we are going to discuss the healing of trauma. All right, good night.